already in 2021, it entered into a phase that will be very, very long, a long grind down and slow decline. And I think that will keep on going for, a decade or two before China is able to grow again. And I think that we'll never see growth rates as high as we did in the 1990s and early 2000s. But that's just that's just the way economies work. Also, China fed its growth with a ton of capital investment for a number of years, and that strategy has simply run its course. China's economic, what would you say, 特色? Its specialty or something in the Chinese economy is to make things at scale very cheaply. So that's really kind of a superpower, the China's ability to build at scale, but it also doesn't create deep value. It tends to undercut value of the existing products on the international market, to overtake the production of foreign companies that have had those niches in the past, and to hammer down the prices. So the beneficiaries of those technologies tend to be the export markets that buy the same products cheaper than they used to buy them. So that's definitely a benefit, but it's not necessarily a benefit for the people of China.
All right, so thank you so much for being willing to talk to us. I'm Ishao, I'm the news host today. But thank you, Anne, for just being willing to speaking with us. If you want to introduce yourself a little bit to our audience to start us off.
What's there to say about me? I've been I lived in the mainland for a long time. I live in Taipei now. I ran for a long time. I've run this economic research company called J Capital Research. And we do research on listed companies, some of them Chinese, a lot of them not Chinese, and that's what we do.
Thank you. So you've worked and researched in China for more than 25 years, and you have long observed the Chinese economy as, an entrepreneur, researcher, businesswoman, and you've also worked for US government for a little bit as well. So we trust like your voice. So the recent big news is that the Chinese government has released the official data of its physical revenue in 2025. And it showed the declining for the first time since the pandemic. And China's GDP still grew by around 5%, but the tax revenue increased by only 0.8%. So we want to throw out the data here because we want to hear from you, from this data and this report. What do you think is behind this drop in its physical revenues, and what does it mean for the Chinese government and for the broader economy, in your perspective?
Well, there's less consumer activity. I'm sure that you talk to lots and lots of people who are based in the mainland, and they're kind of depressed. Unemployment is quite high. Even the people who are employed at jobs that are not paying as much as they were a couple of years ago. People, because of the long shutdown, and because a lot of people were depending on selling property, now they've become very, very risk averse and afraid to, spend a lot of money at once, because they think that they might have to live off their savings. So it's not a good consumption environment. The fact that the tax income has risen at all, one has to really kind of wonder.
Since you mentioned the domestic demands and the low consumptions, and where do you think Chinese economy is standing right now? Or do you think it has entered into a new phase?
Yeah, it did already in 2021. It entered into a phase that will be very, very long, a long grind down and slow decline. And I think that that will keep on going for, a decade or two before China is able to grow again. And I think that we'll never see growth rates as high as we did in the 1990s and early 2000s. But that's just that's just the way economies work. Also, China fed its growth with a ton of capital investment for a number of years, and that strategy has simply run its course. So you can't when I first arrived in China professionally, I guess, or when I first got what I consider a real job, with an American Investment Association in China in 93, the economy was growing, I think, 17%. You're not going to ever have that again.
So, can you talk about, because you were there for 25 years, what was the biggest difference that you felt that around that in the 90s versus now?
Oh, there were tons of differences. So I first arrived in 1985, and it was a very exciting time for the arts. Of course, it was a much more conservative and closed place than it is now, but there was a lot of fermentation in painting and music and literature. There were poets who would travel around and give readings. There were coffee houses that would open up and people would play like pipa music. There were people who would give rock concerts at embassies. There were films. It was a very interesting time with a lot of new stuff kind of bubbling up, and it was not approved, so you wouldn't have the formal art galleries and the movie theaters showing these things, but nobody stopped them from showing either. So you might have an art showing in a park. You might have a music concert in an embassy, and these were all limited to a fairly small number of people who could see them, but it was still a very interesting. Everybody was feeling like excited to sort of rub their eyes and see the rest of the world and start to experiment. And of course, then in the 1990s, you had less of that sort of artistic expression, but everything was growing so much economically and people had so much opportunity. I mean, you could be born on a farm in Jiangxi to parents who were earning, 10,000 renminbi a year at most. And then you could, get into university and get a good job in Beijing or Shanghai. And it was very exciting. People were on the move. Then I think the next decade was a little bit of a trade-off. Like people were still getting rich, but there was a lot of repression of thought and expression. And then, by the time the Olympics rolled around, that was really that trend became really strong. And by the early teens, it kind of, the economy started to get slower. People started to be more depressed about being there. And certainly by the time of COVID, that was true.
Right. So, what first brought you to China? I think you mentioned a little bit a job, right?
Yeah, I got a job with the foreign languages press in Beijing, sort of correcting their English. In those days, it now seems so long ago. I thought China was pretty modern at the time. At the time, the biggest bill that we had was 10 renminbi. And my pay packet was 800 renminbi, so I got 80 of them.
Wow.
And the guy that I married, who was in the same organization as me, I think he earned 80 maybe.
Oh.
So we would get cash in these envelopes every month with your whole pay and in cash, and I would get this big stack, right? And he would get this little bit, but he didn't use much cash then, so he would take out, 10 for the month or something like that, and then he would bicycle up to his mother's place, which was in Yiheyuan in the Summer Palace, which is
Mm.
northwest part of the city, take him like 45 minutes to get there, and he would give his mother the rest of the money because you didn't really pay anything for rent, and you paid some for food, but it wasn't. That's another thing. Back then, we still had what do you call them? Youpiao and liangpiao. Uh,
Mm.
like coupons so that you could get, and I remember trying to buy things like, when I first got there, there's a guy selling sweet potatoes,
Mhm.
and it was really cold. It was winter. I really wanted a hot sweet potato. And he's like, I didn't understand what he was saying. I gave him money, but he said, Liang Piao, but I didn't understand. So he's holding it up and I just didn't understand. So I gave him more money and he was just like throwing up his hands. So it was like that. You used chits to get food and lodging and gas and all of those things.
Mm. And what made you stay for so long?
Well, I got married. So,
I
so
see.
yeah, my husband worked in the same organization. We met and married, and I got a little bit hooked on the language as well. I really wanted to learn it. It's a very difficult language, but a very interesting one. So yeah, so I stayed. And also
Mm.
because the Chinese economy was growing so quickly. And, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, you would run into some foreigner and he'd say, anybody who spoke a little bit of Chinese and knew anything about China, you might be a literature head. You might be somebody who like played music all day, but that's fine. They would hire you as an executive because there was such a dearth of talent. So it was
Mhm.
and meanwhile, I was a journalist in the US, and those jobs are pretty tough to get. There was low pay. I remember I guess it was, so when we were first married, we went back to the US for a couple of years, and then I got a little bored with it. I started applying for jobs in China and the greater China region. And the journalism jobs I got offered were strings with no benefits, and housing at that time in Beijing cost like $3,000 a month. You just couldn't find housing if you didn't have it with your company, or in Hong Kong. Maybe the whole pay packet would be like $25,000. And
Wow.
then, this business association in the US offers me a much higher base salary and full benefits. What am I going to do? So that's what I did.
I see, I see. So what did so you had worked for the US government, is that correct to say?
No, it wasn't the government, a private investment association called the US China Business Council.
Oh, I see. Could you share a little bit more about that experience and from your time in China, how has it shaped your view on Chinese economy?
Well, it was great. I mean, I had been a journalist, and so I really felt, and in journalism, you kind of, and I'm from Washington, D.C. I never met anybody who worked in business, and I didn't really respect it. My whole family is lawyers and artists and academics, right? So I didn't really respect business, and so I felt when I took this job, oh, I'm a failure at journalism. It's so depressing. It was actually really interesting because you go back in those days, you'd have all of these corporate delegations that would go through Beijing, and they would have, they'd set up their CEO to meet the premier and the vice president and the this and the that. And then they would have like 45 minutes in their schedule. So it'd be like, oh, let's arrange a visit to Anne. So so they would like stop by my office and you'd have these CEOs like telling you stuff about their companies that they would never tell you as a journalist. And I'm there like, scribbling notes. I didn't know the first thing. Like the head of Ford Motor Company comes to visit me. We had paper files back then on each of our company members. So I'm looking up in the files like, who is this person? I hadn't heard of Ford. This is how ignorant I was of business. So I look up FMC, Ford Motor Company. FMC is actually a chemical company. So I'm reading all this background on chemicals so that I can see this guy. And then he comes and talks about cars. I'm like, why? So yeah, I didn't know a thing. So it was a pretty quick business education.
And then you started your own companies or news.
Yeah, so it was, toward so I came started that job with a husband and a son. My husband's expertise was as a Chinese Hindi translator, so not highly commercial, right? So I'm mainly the one working in the family, and I've got a son, got a stepson, and then I had my daughter at the U.S. China Business Council. And then I sort of go through that stuff and, get my maternity leave. And then I'm getting a little bored. So I have lunch with a friend and she says, "What do you want to do next?" And I say, "I'd like to go back into journalism, but there isn't anything here." And she said, "Well, why don't you start something? I'll stake you." So sure, I'll do that. So I started this newspaper.
Oh,
So I
wow.
did that for a few years. That was quite a seesaw. And yeah, so that's what I did.
Can you share the name of the newspaper?
Yeah, it was called City Weekend. I think it's still there. At the time we were in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and we expanded to some rough travel guides and to various different things. We had a Chinese language travel site, but all of that closed down. But I think that City Weekend is still publishes.
Mm. So do you consider yourself entrepreneur in China among the first batch of foreign like expats?
I don't know. I'm a jack of all trades. I kind of, go with the flow. So that's what I did. So after that, um, what did I do after that? After that, I started a little, I know. It City Weekend got acquired by a US corporation called Metromedia Corporation, and they wanted me to help them figure out how to use their money. So I made all of these business plans, and one of the business plans was for a software company. So I said to them, "Hey, why don't I?" Because I'm not really used to working for big companies on the corporate staff, right? So I said to them, "Well, how about if I run the software company?" And they're like, "Okay." So I did that. So yeah, I did a CRM software company for a while, and yeah, just this and that, knocking around.
Wow. So I think it would be fair to say that you were very involved in from like foreign investment in China, like doing business and seeing like you were at the front line, seeing, you know, how this sort of unfold in under China's economic climate at the time. How do you think foreign investors' views of the Chinese market have changed over the years? And if you can talk about, some specific policies or measures that the Chinese government used that because now we're seeing this outflow of foreign investment. Or if you
Yeah.
agree, yeah. So if you can talk.
Well, I mean, first of all, the attitude of the government did change. So at the very beginning, because China had been closed for a long time and had very little foreign investment, it had very little, capital investment generally. And so you would go to, you would show your white face in some town and they would be like, "Welcome, meet the governor, be on television. Oh, hooray." Like it was oh my God. There was one time I went to an investment conference in Zhengzhou, and and all of the other investors there were from Africa and India, and they wanted to put like a white person, American or European, in front. So they put me in front, and they had it televised, and they had all the cameras on me. I had no idea it was going to be such a big deal. And then the governor invited me to dinner, and it was, yeah, that was life back in the early 1990s and late 1980s. And then generally, and it was an environment where, a factory manager of a tomato canning plant in the middle of Illinois could come to Beijing and meet with the vice premier.
Mm.
And that was very exciting to a lot of foreigners, and it helped create a class of people who were transplanted from the U.S. or Europe who persuaded their parent companies to invest a lot of money. And of course, that's what was intended by that sort of dealing with people. But China matured, it got more money in. It also discovered capital markets rather than just foreign direct investment, and it got a lot more difficult to meet Chinese government officials, to get information about what was going on in the Chinese government, to get your projects approved, all that sort of thing. So the Chinese government attitude changed. Also, different industries are different ways. So my newspaper company, for example, was very, very highly regulated, very difficult, constantly had to meet with regulators and navigate
Mm.
problems. The
And that was
software
what
company,
time?
that was, let's see, 98 to 2001, something like that.
Mm.
The software company, on the other hand, was like, fine, whatever you like, we're going to give you money. So there was a rebate on individual income taxes for the Chinese staff to encourage them to be in software. It was really easy to get approvals. It was really easy to, because there's a ton of red tape involved in Chinese business that you don't necessarily notice right away, but once you're in operations, it's just a huge overhead. But in the software business, wasn't like that. So, it depends a lot on whether you're in a sector that's encouraged or not.
Mm. When you mention red tape, can you say a little bit more about it? What do you mean?
Yeah, for example, you as a company, this may have changed now, but when I was operating companies, you had a capital account and a current account. So you would invest your money and you dump, let's say, $100,000 into a bank account, but you wouldn't be allowed to use that money. You'd have to go to the bank and say, well, I want to withdraw $10,000 because I'm buying computers. And they would say to you, well, do they really cost that much? How many people? Right? And it's your money. And so it's just, and you'd have to fill out a lot of forms and um, if you want to lay somebody off, like if you're not doing so well and you want to lay people off, then you'd have to get approval for that. You'd have to apply. And then, of course, the person wouldn't agree with you. So it would be a whole process. If you wanted to increase the amount of things that you were producing, you'd have to get approval for that. So it was a constant back and forth with the regulators. And the regulators, they're depending on what industry and what ministry and things like this, they're not necessarily motivated by the desire to see more business in their area. They may be motivated by other things, like for example, like I remember in at the end of '93, they used to have this special currency for foreigners called the foreign exchange certificate, and then they'd have the renminbi for Chinese domestic people, and you weren't allowed to use the renminbi if you were foreign. Like if you took a cab or something, they wouldn't accept renminbi. If you were foreign, they'd only accept the FEC. So then at the very end at the beginning of 1994, I think it was January 1st, because of something that Zhurongji did, they got rid of the FEC and they unified the exchange rate. So what was happening before was that the official exchange rate, which applied to the foreign exchange certificates, was 3 to 1, right?
Mm.
$1 for 3 FEC. But the renminbi, unofficially in a lot of swap markets, as they called them then, was trading at over 8 to 1. So, but they were, officially recognized to be at the same rate. So it really kind of wasn't fair. So we paid our rent our rent for the office was denominated in FEC, or I guess it was in US dollars. And I got that was not when it changed so that there was only one renminbi, of course, the exchange rate was much more favorable. So there was a directive from the top of the government saying you have to take renminbi and it has to be at the renminbi exchange rate. I brought this regulation to the office that managed the rent of our office, and I said, look, now we're paying in renminbi, and they were like, no, we're not going to do that. There was a lot of stuff like that. You had to, initially, being American, I was very sort of by the book, and I thought that, a regulation would mean that would be accepted. But no, there's a lot of, there's a lot of sort of interpersonal management that you have to do in China.
I see, I see. Why do you think the outflow of foreign investment now?
Um, I'm not sure so much that it's an outflow as a lack of inflow. People don't trust it anymore because I think for so for good reasons and bad reasons. So the bad reasons are kind of like, I don't, good and bad is probably the wrong characterization, but one reason is that a lot of foreign companies overinvested in physical assets and infrastructure because they couldn't get very clear information about what was going on in the Chinese economy, especially outside of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. So they didn't understand the nature of the growth. And so they thought, well, China is just such an amazing, magical place. We should just establish more restaurants or establish more stores to sell our things. So they overinvested, and then they found that gradually sales slowed down and the investment was not worth it. So that was one problem. Another problem is that in many types of investment, the government made it very difficult to get your money out. So if you were profitable, then you would find that there was a lot of difficulty in getting the U.S. dollars back to the U.S. And so people, once they had that experience, they stopped trusting it. A lot of it is around poor statistics, and a lot of it is around these arbitrary arrests in China, or the what do you call them? When you stop people from leaving because there's some active legal dispute.
Mm,
People are very anxious about that sort of thing, and so it's slowed down the visit of foreigners by quite a bit. And when people don't go into China, then they don't invest.
Is your company still there? The software company?
The software company um, disappeared with Metromedia Corporation, which was the US corporation. Yeah.
I see, I see, I
So
see.
no, the software company isn't there anymore.
Right.
And I
So
did an online media company too, which also got acquired by a Hong Kong listed company, and they they didn't, yeah, they that closed down as well.
I see, I see. And around what time?
That was in 2006, something like that. I forget.
Mm, mm-hmm.
2008 maybe. I
And
forgot.
which year did you leave China?
Well, I left in the middle of 2014 when our youngest graduated from high school, and so everybody was over in the US. I was still spending half my time in China, going back and forth up until COVID when everything's shut down.
I see, I see. And what brought you to Taiwan?
Well, my daughter lives here, so
I see, I see, I see.
I wanted to be with her. And also, I'm comfortable in the culture. I
Mm-hmm.
like Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, this is a bit of a bigger picture question about the current, like from your perspective. So, a lot of Western medias and or think tanks, they say like Chinese era of rapid growth is over, and it's sort of in a collapsing stage that the economy is heading into a long period of slowdown. And they often point to problems like you also mentioned a little bit, like property crisis, local government debt, deflation, shrinking workforce, and so forth. And some economics economics, they see that this is different because on the other hand, they say that these challenges are part of a normal structural transition, pointing to China's progress in areas like new energy, AI, and advanced manufacturing. And they see as signs of a shift toward higher quality growth. So there's two as like main like two this different points of views. While at the same time, the Chinese government, they argues that the China collapse narrative is exaggerated and overlooked, and it overlooks the country's resilience. So, what do you think among all these like voices? How do you see the current state of where China is at in terms of its economy?
As to the first part of your question, those new areas, high tech areas, are a very small portion of the economy, and they don't, whether or not batteries or EVs are growing, that doesn't bring up the rest of the Chinese economy. So it does something for some people, but not for a lot of people. Secondly, China's economic, what would you say, 特色? Its specialty or something in the Chinese economy is to make things at scale very cheaply. So that's really kind of a superpower, the China's ability to build at scale, but it also doesn't create deep value. It tends to undercut value of the existing products on the international market, to overtake the production of foreign companies that have had those niches in the past, and to hammer down the prices. So the beneficiaries of those technologies tend to be the export markets that buy the same products cheaper than they used to buy them. So that's definitely a benefit, but it's not necessarily a benefit for the people of China. So that's the first part of your question. As to the second part, you really have to ask how is the economy for whom, right?
Mm.
So there was a great book that I think we've all, relied on, published in 2021, uh, called I think it was called Invisible China, Scott Rosell and Natalie Hell.
Mm.
Um, and it was about the unevenness of the distribution of resources in China, how there's, roughly almost 60% of the country that has not really benefited from the tremendous economic growth. And of course, most of what's a shame about that is that 60% of the country that hasn't benefited. But also it sets a poor stage, or creates a poor foundation for growth in the future, because you don't have the same sort of workforce that's trained and able that you do in a country where things were better distributed. So it makes you really kind of sad about the property explosion, because you had this massive opportunity from the stimulus in 2008 and 2009 that could have created an amazing educational system, and a public health system, and pension, and really set people up for the next phase of growth. And instead, you just built all this empty stuff. So now you've got, these cement blocks sitting on what used to be farmland all over China, and nobody's living in them. And it's a waste.
Yeah, when you mentioned the 60%, you think they're mostly 老百姓. Like when you said, we should really ask how's the economy for whom. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Who are those people?
Mhm.
So it's really simple, because China still has a system of hukou, of residence permits. So people are divided by rural versus urban residence permit. And I know that the urban permit has moved to a lot of, that you've expanded the number of urban permits in the economy, but in a kind of cheesy way, so that the benefits flowing to those people have really not been as great as the benefits that the people who were born in Beijing or Shanghai get. And that's really where the dividing line is, because there are a lot of systems in China that flow from your designation as urban or rural, whether it's the number of roads that are the density of roads, whether you're allowed to build a subway, whether you have a certain type of pension, a certain type of health, access to schools. So, the number of academic high schools as opposed to technical high schools, it's really a tremendous menu of benefits flows from the hukou system. And that's the fact that China doesn't eliminate the hukou system, but limits where people can live and how they're designated is really a huge impediment to development.
Um, and so where do you say you will stand? You think China is now entering to this like rapid slowdown period? Or because in your book you also talk about the tightening and the opening following Chinese history in terms of economy. So where do you think the phase is at right now?
Well, I mean, China's economy is clearly weak and slowing, and doesn't have any prospects for getting any faster, or providing people with any more opportunity in the foreseeable future. I think this has a lot to do with the governing system, and the people who want to control China and how they want to control it. There's a lot of deep reforms that the economy needs, but they wouldn't be to the benefit of the ruling party, so they're not ever done. So, there's a lot of positives that have come out of the period of expansion, particularly in the infrastructure built after the Olympics, and the global financial crisis and the stimulus in China. So, Chinese cities, or top tier cities at least, are quite pleasant to be in now. There isn't a lot to do. Culturally, they're not very exciting, but a lot cleaner than they were. The subway systems have extended very far. The fast trains are great. So you don't have to spend all your time, on delayed airlines anymore. So, that stuff is good. It's just, the average person's income is not rising.
Well, there is this increasing expansion of Chinese companies doing business overseas. It has become like a clear trend. How do you see this wave of Chinese companies going global, and which industries and companies from your observation or experience are leading it?
Aren't that many of them. I mean, that's been going on. There's been a government program to support that ever since Jiang Zemin's era, and a lot of money behind it. But it doesn't, as I said, the strength of the Chinese economy is in scale and economy, let's say. So making more things cheaper and more efficiently. And so that doesn't create brands. I mean, try to think of any Chinese brands you know of. Like, people have heard of BYD, but they haven't like bought a BYD or driven one, or seen it on the road. They've just heard about it in the news. Otherwise, the brands that you've heard of, like Qingdao, for example, are from before liberation, right? Before the communists took over. Whereas, compare that with Japan. There's so many brands that we know of, and Japanese production in the US is just, like, I doubt the average American even knows that Sony is a Japanese brand, right? So that is whereas Chinese companies tend to leave the mainland as if they were, deep sea divers, in a capsule with their oxygen, and always with making sure that they're tethered to the mothership, because, God knows what might happen, and bringing as many Chinese workers as you can with you, and, staying in dormitories and eating Chinese food, and, just making sure that you're not too, like, polluted by the outside atmosphere. That's kind of the way Chinese companies come abroad.
Why do you think this is like this, right? So there's, you've said the strength for Chinese companies is that they can produce big scale of stuff in a very cheaper ways. But in the meantime, globally, as you share, they're not recognizable brands from such a huge country. So yeah, what's your observation? Why?
Well, I mean, there's some cultural reasons, but I think it's fundamentally the incentives in the economy and where the profit goes, and the fact that's the way you make money in China, to make a whole lot, to take one thing like a solar panel and to commodify it to the extent possible and just produce as many as you possibly can. So you take an existing technology and you replicate it. And that's definitely not nothing. It's absolutely overcome industries like medical machinery, like solar panels, like batteries. There's all sorts of stuff where China has become utterly dominant. Like, are there any, television sets made in America or Europe anymore? Are there any DVD players? Are there any, any of those electronics things? Those all got totally sucked up by China in the early 2000s. Of course, those Chinese companies also lose money, but they dominate those sectors.
I know like your firm, J Capital, was among one of the earliest to expose Luckin Coffee, Racing Cafe's accounting issues, the fraud. Um, but today, Luckin is expanding again in China, and it has begun entering the US market. There's one that's newly opened last year in New York City, and they're still expanding. At the same time, brands like Hey Tea or 蜜雪 Bingcheng, they're all like 奶茶 industries, are starting to expand in the United States. So, what do you make of it? Why do you think the US government allows these companies to enter the US market? And um, what do you think it means to the companies themselves? Um, and you know, do you think this is a trend other industries and brands might follow?
Well, I mean, Luckin Coffee, I haven't looked at in quite a few years because I figure, it went private. It's off over the counter shares went way up in value. The narrative became, oh, well, they've cleaned out all the problems and now they're back. I doubt it. I think that once companies have problems like that, then the problems stay around. They just, change their character. But I haven't gone back to take a look. Um, Luckin Coffee. I mean, I used to go there a lot in China because you could always get free coffee, and you could always like sit at a table and like consume nothing, and get served hot water or whatever, and sit there for 3 hours and have your meetings there, and read the free newspapers that they had. And um, like they would have this thing where if you signed up online to be in their Luckin Club or whatever, they would give you a free coffee. So you just sign up under different email addresses every time, and then you get a free coffee. And I remember being in a large Luckin shop in Nanjing, and they would only take Alipay and they wouldn't take cash. And I was just in a bad mood and I didn't want to give them my Alipay. I wanted to give them my cash, and they wouldn't. So I said, fine. So I sat down and I just drank a pot of hot water with lemon. And I was meeting somebody, so I was there for like 2 hours or 3 hours, and I went upstairs to the ladies' room, and I passed all these other people who were just sitting at tables consuming nothing. And I think, this is central Nanjing. It's got to be really expensive real estate. This cannot be a good economic model. So that kind of led me to think more about Luckin. I don't know about the US expansion. I think you have to wonder, if Luckin Coffee costs exactly as much as Starbucks does, are people going to be going there? Because generally speaking, you're going to choose the Chinese brand only if it's cheaper. As for the Naicha sort of thing, I've never understood that. I don't understand why Naicha or boba, what do you call those places? Bobo tea places? Why they're so popular in China and people line up, and there are quite a few of them in the US too, but you don't get sit down places where people get, go in and have their bobo tea and snacks and things and meet people. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just cultural. Maybe people don't like it as much. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they're expanding a lot in the US. If just in New York City, it's like you can find different brands of Naicha and different bureaus, different,
Yeah, you
yeah.
can, but that's in, pretty cosmopolitan places and a
Mm.
few college towns. But if you go to your average, I don't know what, like St. Louis sort of place, in the middle of the country, a pretty industrial city, you're really not going to find Naicha.
Hmm. So do you think that the reason they've expanded this, quickly in the US market is because the market sees it as profitable?
What, Naicha?
Or yeah, Luckin Coffee or everything, because the fraud didn't seem to affect its expansion right now.
I mean, as I say, I haven't followed it, so I don't know what kind of money that they've raised since then. Of course, these expansions are always fueled by capital investment, so you have to look at what money they've raised, and are they profitable on the in operating cash flow? Who knows? I haven't looked. I doubt it.
Mm. So we've talked about, Chinese companies Chuhai, which, you know, despite the domestic demand being weaker now, the country is posting record trade surpluses, right? Do you think exports can continue to serve, or is it a key pillar supporting China's economic growth? And is it sustainable in the long run for the government's stability in terms of ruling and for the economic growth in China?
Wow, those are those are big questions. It's a very remarkable thing. The fact that you have to wonder about the um, the benefit to the Chinese people of these humongous trade surpluses, because people are pretty depressed and unemployment is pretty high. So to be stockpiling 1.1 trillion US dollars a year is really pretty remarkable. So if you have that type of trade surplus, you wonder why economically the domestic economy is not doing better. Um, as for whether it's sustainable, I mean, it's been sustained. That's becoming the trade exports have become more and more important to the economy as the economy has gotten worse. One of the key reasons for the stimulus in 2008-9 was because China was very concerned about domestic international demand declining and wanted to replace it with domestic demand. So it was almost like a work progress administration, like an FDR sort of thing, where they wanted to, create this massive engine domestically in order to replace exports. As that's declined, exports have risen. So, and imports are weak. So that's also a sign of a weak domestic economy. So one wonders how good that is. I think that the Chinese trade surplus has been a political problem for China for decades now, And I think that the international system that everybody put together to sort of, manage trade among countries really did not anticipate having a massive surplus country like China enter the system. And the way it entered the system, it entered the system very decisively with the WTO entry in 2001. And I think that it kind of put the international system off kilter. And what you've had is a problem, I think a political problem with Chinese trade, with China's trading partners, so the US and the EU principally, have failed politically to deal with the profits that were made in China by their companies, and instead have sort of blamed all the problem. They have taken all that money, all those huge surpluses that China made, plowed them into tax havens and the banking system internationally, and made them disappear into the pockets of wealthy people, created vast differences in the vast wealth gaps between the average person and the Elon Musks of the world. And it's become an enormous political problem in the West. And I think that was essentially a Western political failure to deal with this changing trading system.
Do you think that this surpluses of, China's investment in the global economy, do you think this is reshaping global investment and the global financial system?
Is it reshaping the global financial system? I'm not very well qualified to talk about that. It certainly reshaped global politics, another topic on
Mhm.
which I'm not qualified to comment, but I'd like to comment nevertheless. Because, what is the Chinese trade surplus? It's treasury bonds in the US, it's Euroclear bonds, it's Japanese bonds, it's Korean bonds, it's international assets, right? That's what dollar surpluses are, international assets. And so the fact that countries like the US, for example, have failed to take that investment and plow it into new infrastructure here has created, or here in the United States, has created very serious political divisions and strife. It's not something that you blame on China. It's kind of nobody's, it's not to blame anybody except the antiquated political system that was built in the United States hundreds of years ago and never anticipated trade of this level.
Going off from that, um, in your book, The Wild Ride, you can also talk about like what brought you to write the book, but you mentioned that China's rise has profoundly impacted, the global economy and globalization itself. So, but in the Western public discussions, mainly we often see that people focusing more on how globalization has shaped China. So in your view, would it be more accurate to ask how China has been shaping globalization, and why do you think so? And how might China continue to, um, in your opinion, influence the global economic order in the future?
Well, I mean, clearly, China in the first couple of decades of openness to the West created a really big hollowing out of the industrial capacity in the West, and you had a massive movement of productive capacity to China, which then, took those factories, expanded them, made them more efficient, made whole cities into factories, and took the margins right out of foreign products. So, you had one story after another in the 1990s of, Georgia red, was it called, that what it's called, sandstone gravestones, being made in Tianjin for 40% less, even after shipping. And then it would be, crawfish from Louisiana, which are then farmed in China and sold to the US more cheaply. And then ostrich feathers, which they use for the Mummers Parade in Philadelphia every year. And China develops all these ostrich farms in Ningxia. Then you have cell phones and all sorts of electronics, and Foxconn builds these cities with 250,000 people resident in one place, just making electronics for the U.S. market or for the foreign markets much more cheaply than they can be done overseas. And is it a great thing for China? No, they have to put like suicide nets outside all of these facility, all of these apartment buildings where people live. But all that manufacturing did go to China, and it's created a lot of the motion of those, the transformation of those physical facilities has contributed a good deal to poverty in the United States and Europe. Again, not something that you blame on China. You blame it more on the political system in the West, but that is what's happened, and it created a good deal of resentment toward China. Where it goes in the future, who knows? Who knows? I think that we're in a world now that's less about particular countries rising and falling and becoming powers, and more about global power systems.
Can you expand on that? The last sentence, the last comment.
And what's a good way of explaining this? I think that, for example, the rise of Bitcoin. This is something that's totally cut free of borders. And the people who enrich themselves with Bitcoin, the U.S. president, for example, pay no attention to borders because they have a currency that doesn't have to be regulated or exposed to at all. So currency can sort of be free of borders. You have a whole lot of you've had this massive rise in tax havens, places like the British Virgin Islands and the Caymans and Isle of Man and this sort of thing, which kind of fall between, they fall into a gray area. So they don't need to give their corporate records to anybody. If you commit a crime in those places, then probably other countries aren't going to get the records on that crime. Their banks are secret. They become these sort of black holes for money and for frankly international criminals to continue activities there. Why'd I go into that? Oh, just the internationalization of economic activity is now, militaries now tend to be, you have a lot of private militaries, you have a lot of, you have the extension of military force by private individuals like Elon Musk, for example. And information has become globalized. There are, countries that try to put up barriers, but to a very large extent, information doesn't have any borders. So, national borders are no longer all that relevant to how countries rise and fall, or how certain peoples and ethnicities rise and fall.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned that in this era, right, the globalization, the international without borders kind of world right now, you said if there were to blame, you would say that the Western political systems failed can you expand on that as well? Like where do you think that could have done better in terms of how, when you mentioned how China um, is impacting this, globalization?
Well, I mean, look at it from the micro perspective of a particular company. So you have a
Mm.
company, let's say, a textiles company in the US that's making, let's say, bedspreads in North Carolina. And then they find that they can go to China and get a contract manufacturer for a tenth of the price, or let's say a fifth of the price. So they do that and they lower the price, they export back to themselves in the US and they lower the price of the bedspreads, but they also increase their profits. And then a lot of those profits. So basically in the United States from 1980 until the present day, there's basically been a long con by the Republican Party and by the Democratic Party as well to persuade the public that government is useless, that government is a scam, that government is overfunded, and that the people who really know how to run things are corporate titans. And there was a vast deregulation that started with President Reagan, really, to make it to allow agglomeration of media companies and also of capital, and to reduce any restrictions, reduce taxes and reduce restrictions on the movement of capital and all sorts of other things that were considered problematic for companies in order to raise profits for corporations and to also put more of those profits in the pockets of the managers and the owners of the companies. So you had we could go through a bunch of the history of that, but I think that we all understand that from the vast enrichment of corporate managers up to the vast enrichment of corporate owners. So now you have a situation where you have people worth over hundreds of billions of dollars, and in one case $1 trillion, and then you have the average person in the United States not earning more on a inflation adjusted basis than they did 30 years ago. Meanwhile, the infrastructure is crumbling. It looks 60, 70 years old because it is 60 or 70 years old. China has managed to build fast trains up and down its coasts and between its big cities. The US is still relying on systems that were built in 1960 or so. So you really haven't built new infrastructure or poured some of that money that was going into the pockets of the wealthy into infrastructure investment, into universal health, into improving the income. Here in Taiwan, I was just thinking, I've got a cleaner and I pay her the equivalent of $15 an hour, and I feel bad about that. I think it's not enough, and so I'm going to give her some more. And then it dawned on me, oh my God, minimum wage in the US is only $7.35. And yet the US is so much more expensive than Taiwan is. And that's, that minimum wage hasn't moved in I don't know how many decades, but a really long time. And that's what should have changed. That's where the political system in the United States has really, really fallen down. I think that there's a lot of that same thing is true of European countries, but I'm more acquainted with the US.
Mm. And you think that also like kind of plays like a key factor in terms of US-China um, economic relationships in a way?
I don't know about that. I think that a lot of anger and resentment has been deflected onto China when really the problem is more at home. So there tends to be, obviously there's a ton wrong with China politically, but in China's dealings with the United States in general, The problem is more in the distribution of the profits in the United States rather than in China per se. And yet the whole political system has, how America should deal with China and deal with China's imports and what it should sell to China. These are whole separate issues. However, there is a great amount of public resentment toward China that I think is more about the quality of life in America than about China.
So why do you think there's this public resentment? What are people resenting against about China?
Well, everybody saw all the infrastructure and the employment go over to China in the 1990s and 2000s. If you're living in a town where 70% of people are employed by the same, like a machine tools company. And then they decide they're gonna make a Chinese plant and close the one in Illinois. People in Illinois remember that and really resent that, and with good reason. That's happened all over the United States and lots of parts of Europe, and it's true, it's an issue. It's a big issue. I think the bigger issue is, why has the United States allowed profits that came from those activities to go into the pockets of individuals rather than into communities that lost those factories?
And you think it's still happening now? It's an ongoing issue, or has it died down a little bit?
Is it still happening now? Hmm. Uh, Not so much now, I think.
Why do you think so?
Well, the kind of internationalization of industry and the offshoring happened already. Now you're seeing more reshoring, or more sort of selective reshoring of portions of the process. Of course, an awful lot of this comes from the technical revolution of the 1990s as well. So before the 1990s, before all the telecommunications technologies, it really wasn't an option to put your software in this country and your physical production in that country and your design in this country. There was no way to split those things off, and then telecommunications technologies made that possible and created a lot of companies that specialized in one of them. You can outsource your accounting, and you outsource your personnel, and you outsource your IP and your design development and manufacturing. You have whole companies that don't do any of these things, whereas you used to have, prior to the 1980s, you had whole companies that were just vertically integrated and did all of those functions in-house because it wasn't an option not to. So, that's really changed the nature of offshoring as well.
Mm, um, I have one last question. Um,
Mhm.
uh, so for so you're doing J Capital is a short seller firm, right? So are there any companies, Chinese companies, you're looking into right now?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't tell you if I were. Um, the markets in the US have become so bubbly and irrational that we're just, waiting before we make a move in that. But we do publish a newsletter on companies that we think are problematic, but they're mostly not Chinese companies. What was the last Chinese company we looked at? I forget. They're Chinese companies every now and then, but not that many.
What do you think of their performances?
Chinese companies,
What?
obviously some of them are fine, some of them are good. There is a problem with Chinese companies listed in the US because they fall into this sort of lacuna between Chinese and US regulators, where US regulators can't get access to a ton of information and often apply lighter standards. And Chinese regulators feel that it's not their lookout. So you have a whole industry in China that's grown up around helping Chinese companies make their results look better. So you do tend to get a certain, a higher proportion of fraud out of Chinese companies.